Welcome to today's Explainer. We are jumping right into a really fascinating, honestly pretty philosophically dense essay today. We're looking at how different cultures and spiritual traditions across the globe approach something incredibly complex: human sexuality. Now, you know this is a subject that's historically tricky to discuss without, well, personal biases getting in the way. But today, we're relying strictly on the source author's cross-cultural analysis, mapping it out step by step. So let's just start right here with the big question. Can we actually discuss human sexuality objectively? The author hooks us with this premise right out of the gate, basically arguing that no, it's almost impossible. Why? Because our views are just so heavily colored by ingrained cultural imagery. In a lot of societies, subliminal images of intercourse immediately cloud the whole discussion. But, and this is a big but, if we peel back those layers, the author points out that the ultimate drive behind most human endeavors, whether it's classic fairy tales or the pursuits of highly successful leaders, is actually this profound, fundamental human quest for intimacy.
Okay, let's dive into our roadmap for this explainer. First, Abrahamic rules and paradoxes. Then, Eastern and indigenous perspectives. Third, the Buddhist approach. Fourth, defining nature and misuse. And finally, free will and karma. We're starting with a broad survey of world religions before narrowing right down into the author's specific spiritual framework.
All right, Part 1, Abrahamic Rules and Paradoxes.
Right off the bat, the source notes that societies heavily influenced by Abrahamic religions often have this deep-seated fear, or maybe fascination, with sexual imagery just lurking beneath the surface. To really understand this, the text grounds the attitude in the book of Leviticus, which explicitly forbids male same-sex acts and classifies them as an abomination. The author breaks this definition down totally objectively. An abomination is defined here as something causing extreme disgust, implying a deviation from nature, or acting as an ill omen that incurs divine wrath. It's really this severe biblical pronouncement that largely shapes this traditional worldview.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The source points out some major paradoxes within these traditions. For instance, the Jewish Talmud upholds the biblical restrictions against same-sex acts, sure, but it actually doesn't condemn the desires or the orientations themselves, only the physical acts. That's a huge distinction. Similarly, while the Quran and Hadith condemn same-sex acts, historical Islamic societies actually often tolerated homoerotic poetry and literature. The text even highlights the Hanafi school of Islam. They historically argued that since male same-sex acts weren't explicitly listed as punishable by fixed penalty in the Quran, like, say, adultery or theft, they should be punished at a judge's discretion, not by fixed severe sentences. So these conflicting interpretations lead to the author's critical question: why are acts driven by the exact same desires judged so differently?
Moving on to Section 2, Eastern and Indigenous Perspectives. The author suggests that these cultures might align quite differently with the laws of creation. Let's look at this comparison. In traditions like Hinduism and Taoism, sexuality is viewed as a totally legitimate goal tied to physical vitality and spiritual energy, which is known in Taoism as Jing. Because they see this as a highly refined art of harmonizing masculine and feminine energies, they are historically far more accepting of gender fluidity, even recognizing a third gender. Now flip to the other side. Confucianism and many African traditions are heavily focused on social harmony and family lines. For them, sexuality is strictly channeled into marriage and procreation. Because of this intense focus on family continuity, the text notes these cultures naturally deem homosexuality an anathema against their primary overarching goal.
Section 3. The Buddhist Approach.
Now, what's absolutely crucial about this next point is how the author uses Buddhism as the pivotal framework for the whole essay, basically arguing that it offers the most objective spiritual conclusion. The text cleanly separates two fundamentally different ways of judging actions. While most traditions focus almost entirely on the outer manifestation, policing the physical act itself, Buddhism shifts the focus entirely to the inner motivation and the spiritual consequences attached to it. According to the source, this inner purity, or the lack of it, is the true key determinant that triggers the laws of creation totally regardless of the gender of the people involved.
Let's break down exactly what that Buddhist perspective entails as presented in the source. First up, the emphasis is on avoiding sexual misconduct, but not as a moral failing. Rather, it's because giving free rein to unnatural urges literally binds a person to the cycle of rebirth. Second, the text is crystal clear that celibacy should absolutely not be enforced. Why? Because that only caps the outer behavior without actually controlling the inner urges. Instead, celibacy has to be a completely voluntary choice to help build inner will. And finally, a core tenet here is that earthly reincarnations are essentially bids to redeem mistakes from past misdeeds, basically karma.
Which brings us to Section 4, Defining Nature and Misuse.
Okay, so here we're shifting into the narrow end of the funnel. We're looking at the author's highly specific operational definitions. The first one is unnatural. The text strictly defines this as going against the dictates of nature, specifically diverting the sexual drive away from its role in promoting human life on Earth. To make this argument, the author actually separates gender, which is framed as a spiritual state beyond the material world, from physical intercourse, which is strictly confined to the material body. Therefore, the source concludes that any act diverting the physical drive away from procreation is, by this exact strict definition, unnatural.
Building on that concept, the text defines misuse or abuse as using something in a way it just wasn't designed for, and that generally results in causing harm to the abuser and others. The author claims there is ample historical and modern evidence of specific illnesses associated with excessive or unconventional sexual acts. And according to the essay, rather than just ignoring this, prudence suggests viewing these illnesses as nature's warning signs. It's framed as an objective indicator of harm caused by misusing nature's design.
So all of this builds directly into the author's final logical deduction. Let's walk through it. Step 1. The essay posits that the sexual drive is designed by nature for species propagation and releasing refined spiritual energy. Step 2. The author freely admits that most modern sexual acts completely fail to achieve these high natural purposes. But Step 3 is the ultimate conclusion of the source here. Because homosexuality inherently does not serve procreation, the author argues it objectively fails both tests of natural sexual activity.
All right, Section 5. Free will and karma.
Here is where we explore how the author reconciles personal human freedom with these incredibly strict spiritual laws. And the author actually makes a really significant concession right away. From a purely societal standpoint, a relationship between consenting adults is a victimless crime. The text openly acknowledges that individuals have the absolute right to exercise free will. Therefore, any spiritual transgression rests entirely on the individual's conscience and their own personal acceptance of violating spiritual principles. It is strictly their choice.
However, the crucial point the source makes here is about the actual mechanics of karma. While humans are endowed with free will, unlike animals who just blindly follow nature, that free will is merely the choice to comply or not comply with nature. It absolutely does not override the spiritual law of cause and effect. If a person chooses not to comply, the text states they bind themselves to the cycle of rebirth. But here is the major warning in the text. If someone uses their influence or enticement to encourage others to indulge in these passions, it is no longer victimless. They create actual victims, trapping others in the rebirth cycle, and that incurs severe additional karma.
Despite these strict spiritual mechanics, the author totally recognizes the intense fervor and judgment this subject provokes in society. To address this, the essay drops this really powerful quote from Jesus in the book of John. "Let he that is without sin among you first cast a stone at her." The author explains that Jesus wasn't condoning wrong actions here. Actually, scratch that. It's more like he was calling out the massive hypocrisy of the crowd. The text argues this is entirely applicable today. The reality is, most of mankind is struggling inwardly and outwardly with a distorted sexuality, whether they are in conventional relationships or not. Condemning others while harboring our own inner guilt, the source argues that's just hypocritical.
And that brings us to the author's final, summarizing thesis. Objective spiritual education is vastly more effective than condemnation. Instead of reacting with fear, fascination, or just societal outrage, the essay advocates for an inward, objective understanding of creation's laws. So, I want to leave you with this provocative thought based on today's explainer. If the ultimate goal of humanity is intimacy, and the spiritual laws judge our inner motivations rather than just our outward labels, would our modern debates be better served by deep inward reflection rather than outward judgment? Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive, and keep seeking to understand the why behind the world around us.